Good afternoon. I'm Arun Seraphin, Executive Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. Thank you to all the attendees for your support of NDIA and ETI, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Agile Software Development 101 with Dr. Forrest Shull. This webinar is part of our Tech 101 series, where we try to distill complex technologies into introductory webinars with a focus on their national security impacts. Over the last few years, the Department of Defense has kept a sustained focus on modernizing its processes for acquiring software capabilities to implement important goals set by Congress of increasing the pace at which software-enabled capabilities can be deployed. While this work is still ongoing, there's been already a radical change to policies, workforce needs, infrastructure, and practices employed by programs. Central to all of these developments is the paradigm of agile software development, which is fundamental to many of the practices that have proven so effective in commercial software companies. This webinar will provide an overview of agile software development. What is it? What makes it different from traditional processes employed in the Defense Department? What makes it different than what we used to call waterfall? Why does it matter for developing complex systems that we depend on for our national security? And why is it better able to field innovative solutions? The seminar will also cover how Agile principles have been instantiated into current policy, ways that this affects monitoring acquisition progress, and why these transformations are so important for the Department of Defense, despite all the challenges involved in making such fundamental changes. Some administrative remarks before we get started. All attendee lines are muted. If you have a question during the webinar, you can submit your question in the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. We will do our best to get through all the questions during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We are recording today's webinar for those members who are unable to join us and who wish to review the material at a later date. Within the next few days, we'll post the recording, slides, and answers to the Q&A to NDIA Connect for your review. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Forrest Shull. Forrest is the lead for Defense Software Acquisition Policy Research at the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, an FFRDC supporting the Department of Defense. He leads work with DoD, other government agencies, industry, and academic institutions to advance the use of technical information, data, and technical expertise to inform policies related to software engineering. Currently, he's providing technical leadership to the DoD in support of important initiatives to improve software acquisition, culminating in the development of the department's first software-specific acquisition policy. He's been a lead researcher on projects for DoD, NASA's Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, the NASA Safety Center, DARPA, NSF, and many commercial companies. Forrest received his PhD from the University of Maryland and is also the author of over 100 peer-reviewed publications, as well as the co-editor of the Guide to Advanced Empirical Software Engineering. Forrest, I want to thank you again for joining us and providing us this great presentation. Over to you for your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Arun. It's really wonderful to be here today. I've been looking forward to doing this for a while. And I think you said very eloquently, I think one of the reasons why it's such an important topic when we're talking about agile software development is that these principles that we'll talk about today have really been, as you said, front and center to the really amazing effort that's been going on to revolutionize how software acquisition gets done in the department over the last several years. So let me make sure I can flip. There we go. Okay, so what I wanted to do today, I figured I would start to talk first about why DoD cares. What agile software development really is at heart is a paradigm that talks about how we organize the software, the work of doing software engineering, developing the software capabilities that we care about. And of course, DoD cares about acquiring those, and the acquisition process that we use has to align with the technical underpinnings of the development process underneath it. So first, I'll start to talk about why DoD cares, whether we do it using this paradigm or some other way. And then I'd like to do an introduction to agile software development and what that really means at a technical level, but we'll start by doing it at a more intuitive level first, what this really means, what it looks like, how this, kind of shows up in practice, as it were. And then beyond that, we'd like to get down to think one of the things we've seen over the last several years is that we know a lot of players have really cottoned on and understood that Agile is the way to be doing things these days. And so the buzzword gets thrown around a lot, regardless of some of the technical underpinnings underneath it, and what happens to be there. So once we get through the introduction to the topic, I'd really like to get a little bit beyond buzzwords. And what does it look like if programs in the DoD are doing Agile appropriately in a way that's going to get them the benefits of it? And then finally, I'll end up hopefully trying to shoot down some of the myths. I know there's a lot of conversation, a lot of different interpretations or understandings of what Agile really means. And I'd like to share some of the nuances that we've seen over time and maybe try to shoot down some of those myths that seem to come up over and over again, so that when you're in these conversations and hear the words being thrown around, you can get a better sense of what really should be underneath it. Okay. So to start with, why does DoD care? And to do that, I have to roll back a couple of years. I really started this work in earnest, I would say, around 2017, 2018. And that was a time period where there was a lot of recognition that what the department was doing to acquire software capabilities was really not working terribly well. And I think there was a lot of concern from many of the stakeholders involved. And of course, as Arun said, I'm working at the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, which is the only FFRDC devoted to software. And so these were concerns that were really front and center to a lot of our minds in the work we were doing. But regardless of our opinion, I really like to point to this quote from Senator McCain, where he was looking at one of the troubled programs, the Air Operations Center 10.2 upgrade. And his scathing quote about it having spent $500 million over 10 years and not really delivered much in the way of meaningful capability whatsoever. And that, AOC was its own case, as many of our programs are. But I would say that's not the only program where we saw this type of this outcome. The fact that activities were going off for years at a time, doing things that looked kind of technically meaningful and looked like they were the right thing, and just not being able to produce the outcomes that the department was looking for at the end of it. And so the trail end of Senator McCain's comment there about this being only one example of our record on software intensive systems, I think is pretty accurate. Even the programs that were able to deliver capabilities we're doing so generally over budget. I wish I had better data, but in that software is never done report that's at the bottom of the slide, I think there's a whole chapter there on what that track record looks like. And so I would say it wasn't a particularly high confidence picture overall that was pointing to how the department was acquiring software capabilities. And perhaps that wouldn't be such a bad thing, except at the same time, I think there was a growing recognition that software was in almost every program that the DoD does. I've heard it said so many times that aside from maybe ammunition, most of the systems that the DoD is buying or acquiring these days has software in it somewhere. The growth of that was something that was occurring to people, and there was clearly a sense that we have to get better at this. Over time, there was a long series of expert studies that was done looking at software. I think the latest one, but the one that really kicked off a lot of the transformation for various reasons, was a 2019 study that was done by the Defense Innovation Board. And this again was a set of outsiders. A lot of them came from Silicon Valley, but people who were very much steeped in how the commercial way of doing software really looked like, and had brought that set of perspectives in and looked at what the DoD was doing, and were quite pointed in their remarks, I guess, about what needed to change. One of the takeaways from that study was the fact that they called the DoD way of doing software at that time broken and a leading source of risk. And I think it's important to get that idea of risk in there, right? Because when we talk about the DoD wanting to go slow and maybe some of the traditional processes being slow, a lot of that is driven by a risk and a worry about trying to go too fast and get capabilities that are not ready for prime time, that are going to go out to the warfighter and not be safe, secure, and all the rest. But there's a risk to taking too long, and there's a risk to getting those capabilities out in front, especially nowadays where we find ourselves in a much more competitive environment. And that needs to be factored in as well. Okay. Another one of those long series of studies I'd like to point to is the 2018 Defense Science Board report, which again looked at the way that we were acquiring software in the department and came to many of the same conclusions, actually. but they very eloquently said in their report out, how divergent the DoD practices had gotten from what was going on in the commercial world. And the fact that although there were some thought leaders in the department, really we were becoming quite the laggard in terms of adopting some of these capabilities that made such a revolutionary difference in the commercial field. Okay. And then that brings us to 2022, where as I said, I think there's now a growing recognition. There's a much more intensive effort, and there's been a lot of progress made over the last several years, but that progress doesn't mean that we're done. And so I think it's nice to point to the 22 memo on the software modernization strategy that was signed out by SecDef Hicks, where again, she reiterates that our capabilities are increasingly reliant on software, that we as a department to compete need to have this ability to securely and rapidly deliver software capabilities that are going to have such a difference, make such a difference in the future conflicts that we're expecting to be engaged in. And of course, at the same time, this also, she pointed out very nicely, requires the combined focus of a lot of DoD senior leadership. And as we go through the talk today, I'd really like to point out a lot of the ways where there's a lot of players that all need to come together in order to adopt this new paradigm and make sure that our acquisition policies are adapted to it across the board so that we don't have friction points where we're trying to get these capabilities out more quickly. Okay. So that was the brief overview of why the DoD cares and has paid so much attention to this too. In terms of what Agile software is, I'll start first off by saying, well, here's a representation of the traditional way of how we have, up until very recently, I think, done software development and software acquisition in the department. I think it's probably safe to say that many of us realize that software is a very different beast than many of the other components that we build our systems out of. It is a very pure logic. What we're doing when we're creating software is really coming up with the flow of logic and the set of commands that are going to tell a computer system what it needs to do to get the capability out at the end of the day that we're expecting. But at the heart of it, it's a very creative process, and it's an engineering activity. And so there's a set of activities that we have to go through, I should say. Starting from the requirements analysis, really understanding what that behavior has to be, architecting what the internals of the software are going to look like, designing those components, actually writing the code, and then testing it, deploying it, getting it out to the field and repeating. And so we've tended to organize this in the past in what we call the V model. And the idea here is that you start at the top left with a very high level operational concept of what the system needs to do. And then you go through a series of successive refinements, making that more detailed. You're getting down to first high-level requirements and then very detailed requirements, and then designing the components, understanding what behavior each component has to do, implementing all these things. And then you walk back up the right side of the V, where I start to first test very thoroughly and extravagantly the individual units, those components, and then start to integrate at higher and higher levels, so that by the time I get to the top right of the V, what I'm evaluating is how well it really responds to those very high-level operational concepts I had at the beginning. And so in a nutshell, those are many of the different technical activities that go into developing software. And what I would say is that we haven't thrown those away. These are still part and parcel of what we have to do to actually get software capabilities out at the end of it. But we can no longer go through this in a very heavyweight, time-consuming way. This V model, in many cases, would take years to get through, especially for some of our larger DoD programs. And typically what would happen is by the time I pop out on the right with some capability, because the technology is moving so fast underneath me, the technology itself might be obsolete. That if I were to redesign the system at that time, I have a very different set of expectations and a very different set of components I might build it out of. And at the same time, what that requires, well, let me go to the next slide here. Well, what that requires is the engineers working for a long period of time without necessarily checking back with the users. And so we can come up with systems that are exquisitely built and very reliable, but still don't really answer the initial mail. The commercial world went through a sea change starting in around 2001, I guess, when the Agile Manifesto came out. And this was a group of thought leaders in software that decided that that way of working was really not providing the value for their customers that they wanted anymore. And so what they came up with was kind of comparison, I guess, where the things on the left side were things that they value more than the things on the right side. That is, we care about individuals and interactions more than just following a process and using the tools. We care about working software more than we care about having documentation that's thorough and analyzable and shareable and all the rest. So what that really did was to take the focus away from some of the things on the right, which really dominated our thinking about software, and push them into the things on the left and really change the way that we organize the work. We're able to get through the work. It changed what we kind of prioritize as our goals as we go through the work of developing software. And we'll come back to this as I go through some of the later slides, but one thing I'd like to point out is that sometimes this is misinterpreted as a way to say that the things on the right have no value whatsoever. You know, we don't care about processes at all. We don't care about documentation at all, et cetera. And that's not true. That's not what the Agile Manifesto was meant to say. It was meant to be a corrective to say that we have to put more emphasis on those things on the left. But it's not like we throw those things on the right off the raft altogether. We still have to worry about those things as well. And I'll come back and talk a little bit later about what some of that balance might look like. But this is the chart, which is a little detailed, but we're going to walk through this and hopefully give a little bit better sense of some of the things I'm talking about here, I hope. What we essentially have here is a timeline where we start on the left, where we identify that there's a new mission need, and then we get over to the right where we've provided that capability in software. The traditional way of doing it is the kind of lighter big arc that's up on the top. So things below the line, by the way, I'm working with the users, some of the other stakeholders, and trying to understand what the work is that I'm actually going to do. Things above that horizontal line in the blue color are the actual technical work of implementing the software. Okay. So in the traditional way, I would spend a large amount of time up front working with the users, trying to understand the requirements, doing that decomposition process I talked about. And then our engineers would go away and implement it for a very long period of time. Again, hey, we've come up with this very detailed set of requirements. Now we're going to march off and implement these things according to the plan, with the idea that everything comes back together and we're able to deliver capability at the end of that cycle. What Agile does instead is it makes this a very more tightly constrained and iterative process, okay? So we do, of course, still begin our work by talking to the users, understanding the requirements, but I'm going to take a smaller chunk of the work, okay? Understand what that first chunk is I'm trying to build, go off and build it, and then come back to the users again and put that in front of them. Usually the best way that we have of understanding what the software needs to do is to show successive approximations of it to the customers, so that they understand what that functionality really looks like, and then come up with their own set of refinements about how to make it more useful. And so we'll spend that second set of time when we go back to the users clarifying the requirements now based on showing them some version of a working model. And then we go off and do the next version of do the next set of implementation, come back and check in with the users again, and so on, so that we might repeat this many, many times. What this means, more importantly than that, though, is that rather than getting all my capability in one big shot at the end, as I do in the traditional approach, I get successive deployments of that capability, none of which necessarily are, have all the capability there, but are some first increments, right? So that I can keep putting something out there, building on top of that, showing the next version of it to the users, and then continuing on that way. The top way, by the way, I'll say, is how you get to Senator McCain's remark, right? Where I go away, I think I have a great set of requirements, and I go away for years and years and trying to build it, and then come back and realize maybe things didn't work the way I thought they were. Maybe it wasn't really what the users wanted. They couldn't really articulate the needs very well up front, or whatever. But I don't find out those problems until I'm very late in the cycle and have spent a lot of time already trying to get there. And we avoid that problem in Agile by making sure that I'm continuing to come back to the users and get these kind of mid-course corrections as I go. Okay. There's a number of different principles that supported the manifesto, where the signers of that document really tried to articulate what it was that they cared about at a more detailed level as well. And I'm just going to touch on a few of these today, given the time that we have. The first one, of course, that they put the emphasis again on satisfying the customer. And what that means is, as we saw in that last figure, the customer really needs to be a part of this process in a way that maybe wasn't always true before, right? If the customer is expecting me to go off for years and years and not to talk to me in that time, then Agile is not going to be a good solution. You know, the customer has to be there, has to be able to articulate at least feedback as they see kind of what we're working on as from the software point of view, but also whether or not that satisfies their needs. And then we work on that together. I think in the traditional process, we always used to look at changing requirements as something problematic, you know, that we just didn't do that requirements decomposition the right way. And now, oh, we have changing requirements. Isn't that terrible? What we do in Agile instead is to kind of say this is a feature, not a bug, you know, that we just know that requirements are going to change all the time. We don't expect that people have the crystal ball and can articulate all these requirements very detailed up front. And ergo, we're just going to build a process around the idea that we need to adapt and elicit these things over time instead. Okay. And then finally, the last one I wanted to mention, 3 and 7 to my mind kind of go together because what we're doing is getting away from the idea that we're walking through a process and the number of process steps I've gotten through tells me something about how good I'm doing. Instead, because we're in an iterative world now where I'm pushing out drafts and then updates of the capability all the time, it's really that working software, which is the primary measure of progress, right? So I'm delivering it frequently. I'm getting it out in front of the user at least every couple months, getting the feedback as I go. And now I don't have to say anything about how many process steps I've gotten through or how many gateways I've gone through. What you're going to judge me on is how good that piece of working software actually is and how happy the users are with it and whether I'm getting closer to what the user actually needs out of it. So there's an implication here that I wanted to call attention to because this is, I think, we can understand this is iterative and it's a different way of thinking about things. But there's a different paradigm shift that goes on here as well. And that's that I'm really changing the way I'm acquiring or developing software from trying to buy a widget where I've specified everything about it up front and now you're just going to deliver me what I've asked you for. To acquiring a delivery stream. I'm acquiring a process. I'm paying the software developers or the software acquirers to work through a process together where we're doing these iterations, getting back in front, and then changing the detailed requirements as we go. Okay. So another way to think about this is I'm getting away from this checklist up front that says, here's the things, go do this, and then when you've done it, it's completed and you've satisfied your contract. To the fact that I'm acquiring kind of this ongoing process, right, where we have constant collaboration. We're continually discovering what value is. I don't know a priori upfront exactly all the details of what that system needs to do to satisfy the need, but it's a process that we're going to work through together because you as the software developer are going to come and show me successive versions of the software, and we're going to understand together how well that really satisfies the need and where we need to go from here. Okay. At a concrete level, now if I get down to what the requirements look like, right, and this is again where the department I think really is working to absorb what these new changes really mean, because it's a very different way of specifying the work and getting away from things. On the left side, in the traditional approach, I tried to put the big law books there, right? I mean, our old way of doing software was to have this detailed documentation about what the requirements were meant to be. I've done all my analysis up front. I've worked this out down to the nth degree. You just satisfy all these requirements and then we're there. One of the disadvantages of that, there are several, but one of the key ones is that it's very hard for me, even as I learn things as I go forward, to ever come back in and reflect that in the requirements, right? Because there's one of the key things about that left approach is that everything has to be traceable. Everything from my operational concept all the way down to those detailed requirements has to be a flow of logic that I can follow to make sure that at the end of the day, I'm satisfying the high level requirements by doing all that, the smaller requirements there. That means as I change my mind, if I decide something else has to be done, there's a lot of engineering work I have to go through to re-update that chain of logic, to re-update all those requirements, to get them signed off again, and so on. And so even if it was possible to do learning and evolve things as I go, it's just not a very, the process is not very conducive to allowing that to happen. In Agile, on the other hand, what we have in terms of requirements is a much slimmer document. So I tried to visualize that there with a much slimmer document. We call that actually in the software pathway actually a capability needs statement. So it's meant to be at a much higher level than a detailed requirements document. Again, one of the implications there being that we want this to be easy to update. As I walk forward, as I go through X number of evolutions of my software, if I realize I need to change something, or the mission has changed, or I need to deal with some kind of changing mission space, it's relatively easy to go back in and make those changes and get it signed off on again, because then that's what we want. We want this to be as dynamic as the mission space that we're trying to fulfill. But at the end of the day, I still need my development team to have a detailed idea of what they're meant to be off and running and implementing for me. And what how we represent that is what I tried to represent there at the bottom as a backlog. So imagine that each of those little blue squares is a specific user story. It's some small piece of capability that makes sense to the user, which can be implemented, distinctly in the software. And so we have a bunch of these things. We know we can specify them. We have a good sense of what some of those small level capabilities are going to be, but we organize them in a way that's very easy to be dynamic. We might pick the first 4 of them, for example, and say that these are the first 4. Once we implement those, we have something we can get in front of the user. And that's actually that getting that first increment of capability out there for feedback is so important. It has its own special name in Agile software development, which is to be the minimal viable product. It's the minimal set of things where I can put that in front of the user and they get a sense of what it is I'm actually trying to build for them at that point. And then we have a much longer string of things. There's more capabilities we know of than we can put into that first MVP. And so we'll keep those on our backlog and maybe have a notional idea of when we're going to get to them. But again, we use tooling for this. And so the idea is that as things change, maybe the user changes their mind, and when they see that first version, there's something that they want much more urgently than originally thought. It's very easy for us to kind of reprioritize these things and put them through and change that ordering without changing the whole process and the whole understanding of the technical work that we're going through. Okay. And this gets into how we track and measure progress. And I'll just kind of hit this lightly now, and then if people are interested, we could probably do a deeper dive in the question and answer. But as you've probably noticed, how I measure progress in this new dynamic world is going to be very different from how I was measuring progress in the old one. If I have a detailed plan and I've broken this all down to 53 bazillion steps, I can measure and tell you how many of those steps I've gotten through, right? And again, one of the things I've tried to argue here today, I hope, is that just because I can implement the things on that plan doesn't actually mean I'm addressing the user needs really as much as I might have thought originally. And so that's maybe not the greatest way of measuring progress. But now we're in a world where things are going to be very dynamic and changeable, right? And users can reprioritize the next thing I'm going to be working on. So the way that we start to get our hands around that is we put things out in a roadmap. And what I've tried to show here is just it's a very high level visual summary. Typically this goes out, I can be much more detailed for the first couple time increments than I can be out in the further off time. But it allows me to lay out the capabilities that I'm going to be needing to do in their kind of expected timeline, right? So we know that we have to get all these things implemented if I'm going to be able to field the system to the warfighter. Here's the ones I think I'm going to do first. Here's what comes after that. I can be a little bit more vague about the things that are further out, but I still have a sense of when I'm going to get to them. And it all has to line up in a way, by the way, that shows me that I can actually get the whole system delivered in a reasonable amount of time, right? So there's some guesswork that goes into this, but again, it has to be based in realism. The different colors, so the different rows here, means that there's multiple lines of effort, right? And so typically what we see from programs is I'll have a different color for each major set of capabilities that I'm working on, because I'm typically doing a couple different things at once. And one of these might also be I'm building out our infrastructure at the same time. So I have a line that says, look, I have some infrastructure things I have to take care of at the same time. And what this gives us, again, is a way that I can articulate the goals. I can have a conversation between the software team and the users about when I'm going to get to major capabilities and how long I think they're going to take, right? So there's still rigor and estimation that goes into this process. It's not a free-for-all. And at the same time, it allows us to do some trade-offs, right? If I wanted to move something earlier, okay, well, what do I have to push off later? It's a zero-sum game about how much work I can do at any moment in time, and this still allows us to lay things out. So what I'm trying to say here is that what we're evolving into as we work with our programs is that whether or not they're on track has to take into account two things. First, are they making progress against the roadmap? And yes, we expect this to be able to change over time, but at the same time, from this, we can get a sense of whether or not they're making big time commitments. You know, if they're continually blowing their estimates about things that are on the left side of this roadmap, maybe we're learning as we go, maybe we're getting better over time, but we need to keep an eye on that. And we have a sense about how accurate those projections are and how problematic they might be, let's say. Secondly, we have to look at the delivered value. So each of these time increments, there's a piece of software that's coming out, right, which isn't going to it doesn't have all the capabilities in there, but is progressively getting closer and closer to having all the capabilities we need. And so one of the things we can ask the users at this time is, well, how much is that working software actually providing capability or value to the mission? And those are the types of conversations we want to be having with our programs, not you came up with a plan 3 years ago, are you still conforming to it or not? Okay. And I'll say too, one of the other things that has been very clear over the last several years is that Congress and GAO, as a result, are very focused on how frequently am I delivering that capability as one of the steps here, right? Because we can look at different time horizons, you know, for how frequently I can get the capability out. But if I'm not able to get working software on a regular cadence, well, then there's nothing else I can do to take advantage of all these good Agile principles, right? That has to be the thing at the bottom of it all that says I am in a rigorous technical process where I can continually get new updates of the capability out in some kind of plannable way. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'll skip this example here. I'll just briefly say that this all sounds good in intuition, hopefully, but we also have to worry about how we scale this up to the very large size of some of the programs that we're dealing with. And there's a whole conversation we could have about that, but I'll just say some of the highlights, at least. You know, what we've done is to take these different these key principles here of the Agile Manifesto and to say, yes, we can actually do these in the context of the Defense Department. Even for large programs, you know, where I have a lot of capabilities to get out, one of the first things I'm worried about is making sure that I can do these smaller batch iterations. You know, so I'm taking on a smaller amount of work. I'm showing that I can get that work done. I'm putting that in front of the user and then moving on to the next thing. So what we typically see is large programs will have many teams all working on these small batches at the same time, right? And that, as long as we can make sure that the user is still involved in that, that's a workable process. We can still do that at scale. That's not a problem. Secondly, of course, yes, it doesn't do me any good to continue to iterate and do small batch size work if I'm not getting the feedback, right? I can still iterate myself into left field just as much as I could waterfall myself into a crazy place, right? So the main thing is, again, getting that user feedback in a way that's constructive and helpful and helps me understand where I need to make mid-course corrections as I go. And again, that's something where we're seeing things are working well so far. One of the things we do in the Defense Department actually is use what's called a user agreement, so that before the program gets started, if they're on the software acquisition pathway, they need to have a written document that says their users are prepared to and willing to engage with the acquisition team on a regular basis. And what that means is hashed out ahead of time, so it's not a surprise to anyone, right? But we need to make sure that that feedback is always there, or else it doesn't do me any good to be Agile. We need to make sure that we have continuous refinement of the backlog, right? So that, again, you know, if I have this long set of items on my backlog, I know where I'm meant to be headed. If I don't use the chance to kind of reprioritize those as I go, again, we're going to get ourselves into a place where we're really not addressing the user needs as well as we should. And so being able to make sure that we can be dynamic, that we can adapt to the user needs as they change is an important thing, and something that's, again, working well in our place. And then finally, the fact that decisions and requirements are constantly validated with data from implementation. Again, this gets a lot more challenging in a large-scale system, especially one where I'm talking about software that might be embedded on a warfighter, for example. So I have all levels of, you know, I can do the software by itself, but then I also want to put the software into a virtual environment, into the real environment, make sure that it's going to work in the operationally relevant places where it needs to get to at the end of the process, right? And that's something that the department is still working through in some cases, but it's mainly because we're always under-resourced, I think, in terms of getting those test environments where they need to be at the right time. But again, that's something that's working well and is able to get to, within the time frame that we need to, where we need to get going. So I'll just kind of briefly hit a few things. I'm running a little bit behind here, but I did want to say, hopefully that intuitive discussion of Agile made sense. One of the things that makes it a little bit more tricky to talk about the details is that there's many ways, many specific processes for doing that actually in practice. And so some of the buzzwords are here. I think a lot of our programs talk about using Scrum. Some of these things can be put in combination with one another. So Scrum and test-driven development, look at different parts of the process. We don't have time here today to go through all of them, but I guess what I'm really just trying to say is there's many different ways of implementing those the high-level principles that we just talked about. So if I'm working with a program and they're using the buzzwords, how do I know if they're really doing the right thing underneath it? Well, one of the resources I like to point people towards is, again, in that Defense Innovation Board study, one of the subsidiary pieces of work that they came up with was what they call the Agile BS detector. And it really tried to get at the heart of this question, right? That if you're talking to a program or any other organization that says that they're doing Agile, how do I know if it's really a good implementation or not? And so they came up with some red flags that should at least cause some pause if you hear them coming up in conversation, right? So if you're talking with the software team, they should be able to talk about how they're reliably getting to the actual users in action, right? Like I said, it doesn't do us any good to be Agile and do small batch, development of capability if I'm not using that as an opportunity to do the mid-course correction, get the voice of the user in there, and make sure that what I'm doing really satisfies the need. Secondly, if they don't have, there's many ways of getting that kind of ongoing feedback from users. We should be looking at bug reports. We should be looking at the voice of the user, getting those frequent assessments over time. We should be bringing them in to do demos to them. There's a lot of different ways where we can make a decision about what works in context, but at the end of the day, there has to be some strategy for doing that. The teams that prioritize meeting a set of requirements over getting something into production quickly, right? I mean, the fact that requirements are helpful and useful, but if I'm making a fetish of, getting those requirements burned down as opposed to listening to the customer and getting them something that they need, well, then that's not very well aligned with Agile principles. Okay. Where I see different roles on the program that are stovepiped, so if someone's saying, well, that's an interesting problem, but that's not my job to figure out. What we see on Agile is, again, everyone has to kind of shift and be more engaged together, so we can't really have these things we used to do in the traditional approach where we would work on a piece of software and then throw it over the wall for the next group to do their thing, and then they throw it over the wall to the next group. A lot of those activities have to become a lot more tightly coupled and a lot more happen early and often in order to work on the timeframes that are envisioned in these Agile deliveries. Okay, and then if I have manual processes, I can't get to doing all this stuff iteratively on tight timeframes if I don't have a lot of automation built into this. And so one thing I think of as I've gone through it today, I think I made this sound like more of a management issue, but it's a technical one too. I need to have the right technical underpinnings in place to enable me to do all this technical work in the right time frame. And so looking and seeing a lot of manual processes is, again, another red flag. I'll just say very briefly, I'll just more point to this as a resource, but the GAO did their own study of both federal space and commercial companies and understood what are best practices for doing Agile in those contexts, and then turned that into an assessment guide. One of the things I like to point people to this one for is that it gives you a sense of what GAO is looking for when they come in looking for their own best practices, trying to understand whether we in the DoD are doing a good job of adopting Agile and getting those principles out. And so they look at things like, not only the technical work, but the team dynamics. Do we see that the team is set up in a way that they can really adopt to this new way of working? Are the staff trained? This is such a sea change that we really just can't take our old workforce and throw it in and expect them to pick up all the nuances of the approach. So do we have folks that are trained? Do we have leaderships and leadership buy-in? Is the organization as a whole supportive of this new way of working? Okay. And then that brings me to the, as I said, the Defense Software Acquisition Pathway Policy, which is, I believe, was signed out at the end of 2020, so relatively new for the department. And if you're familiar with the old way, the old 5000, the wall chart that we used to call it, the horse blanket, right? It was this gargantuan maze of a million different boxes and all the different processing steps that you'd have to walk through to acquire software. This clearly looks very different from that. What we had done to come up with this was work with many of the thought leaders and the early adopters in the department, programs that were already adopting software. And as well, we had a great assist from Congress who required the DoD to set up a set of Pathfinder programs, or pilots, I should say, which were really charted to try out some of these new Agile approaches from which we could learn and then build that into a new process. So some of the things you see here, there's not a lot of gateways, right? So there's not a lot of milestone reviews. If you're familiar with the old thing, for software, at least, we really tried very hard to get away from going through this successive series of reviews, preliminary design review, critical design review, et cetera, et cetera. This pathway really only has two kind of gateways built into it. One, a very lightweight one that says, you know what you're trying to get to at least, and you have someone at your level who's willing to sign off and start the program up. That gets you into the planning phase. And then once you're in there, you have a very tightly time-constrained period to get through to set up many of your high-level strategies, start to play around, do prototypes, to start to understand how feasible some of the technical decisions might be. And then you need to get very quickly out of that and into the execution phase. And once you're there, all those little circles really just mean that you're popping out new software capabilities quite frequently. And again, we're not, we've gotten rid of those old milestones because we're not going to judge you on how many PowerPoint reviews you've been through and how many of these reviews you've managed to make it through. But you're judged on how much software you're pushing out, how frequently, and whether or not that's making a difference for the mission or not. And so many of the principles I've already talked about today are really embedded in here, and that's why things look the way they do. Like I said, this is meant to be very iterative. You're getting capability out frequently and often. You can't do much of what's here without using modern software processes like Agile and DevSecOps, which I think there'll be a future 101 to talk about a little bit more what that means. But essentially, it's the automation piece of this that allows it to happen as quickly and continuously as needed. You can't get out of the planning phase without having your user agreement in place, right? So there is a sense that if I don't have an engaged user who's willing and expecting to give me the feedback, I don't get the chance to really get started and running on the software pathway at all. One thing that's really not visible at the high level, but this is all really, again, predicated on the thought that the government and the vendor are going to be tightly coupled, right? That we don't have this sense of the government throws a set of requirements over and then eventually the vendor comes back with things. But there's a government product owner who's responsible for being involved in each of these iterations, making sure that what the latest set of priorities that are being addressed are always the right ones, that are top of mind. The government is there to give feedback on what comes out of each of these iterations. And it makes that a way of making sure that, again, things aren't getting too far off track in any increment of time. And then again, like I said, a lot of this is really built on the idea that there's automation involved. And one buzzword I should have introduced is the idea that there's automation for continuous integration and continuous deployment. That is, so as I go through each of these iterations of my software, I'm always building a new capability. It gets integrated with the rest of my code base. And I've made it as painless as possible to, if the user likes what they've done, and is willing to sign off on that, we can get it then off to the user as easily as possible. I don't need a lot of manual steps for each of those different activities. The other thing I'd like to emphasize from this is that written into the policy, because it's written into the authorizing language from Congress actually, is the idea that working software has to be popping out of this at least annually, preferably more often, but at the very least annually. And again, that's I think that scares away some of our programs that when they're used to thinking of very heavyweight increments of capability coming out, that does seem somewhat onerous and daunting. But again, because we've taken away all these other checks, that you're used to from the old acquisition process, I've taken away the milestone reviews, I've taken away the other things. we really can't have this thing operating in the way that it's intended without those frequent deliveries of working software being the way that we're measuring program value. And kind of along with that, there's a requirement that each program gets an annual value assessment from their users, so that we do get the milestone reviewers get some, the decision authority gets some view of how useful this thing is to the mission, to the intended users of it. And hopefully we see trends over time where there's more and more value being provided. But if there's not, that's visible, and we can take corrective action as we go forward. So where things are today, again, one thing I'd like to harp on is that this is evidence-based policy, that we've really tried this out. We've seen what the thought leaders were able to do. We've war-gamed it. We've put that in place in the 5000.87 that's out there now. There are increasing numbers of programs actually opting into the software pathway at this point. So I think there's over 50 at latest count that's been publicized by the department. There's a continually expanding amount of guidance and direction that goes on, since I think as we continue to work on transforming the workforce as well, I think there's always a desire for more and more of the how-to work, and that's something the department has been working on providing as well. And then, where we've had the reviews from GAO, I think there's been generally positive, actually, which I have to say I wasn't aware that GAO was allowed to say positive things sometimes, because that's not been always their history of looking at department software. But some of the things I've tried to call out there in their latest report are principles that they found part of their best practices. We're very happy to see in the software pathway, and would really like to see getting out to more of the department policies as well. Okay. But like I said, this is a big culture change. What we're talking about here is really going from a top-down view where I specify those requirements and then you just go build them, to much more of a delegated decision-making environment. So a lot of these iterative policies don't work very well if I have to go all the way up multiple levels of the hierarchy and ask for permission every time I want to make a decision, right? So this has really led to a lot of delegated decision-making, and some of this is baked into that policy itself. So far, I would say that seems to be working really well. But again, it is a huge shift for the department, and this is not something that's going to happen overnight. I think our biggest problem, but our biggest challenge at the moment is making sure that all the other pieces of the software acquisition ecosystem are understanding of these changes and are aligned to the new paradigm. So we, I think, have gotten the policy to a point where it says very good things about what each program manager needs to be doing. But at the same time, there's a lot of the related policies, for example, how I cost these things, how I test these new programs, right? Because I'm not getting big chunks of capability out every couple of years. I'm getting frequent deployments that I would like to get to the field potentially. These are very different ways of working through all those different responsibilities. And I would say we've had engagement from across that large ecosystem, but it takes time to necessarily work through all these details. I think I've said several times that, again, you can't do this in a vacuum. If I'm trying to do this all manually, it doesn't really work. This is a technical process that requires a lot of automation and continuous monitoring. Making sure that all programs have access to that digital engineering infrastructure is, again, a challenge in an organization as large as the department. So it's being worked, but it's, there's still some time to go, I think, to get everything we need. There's resourcing requirements that are done, right? So that testing example, we're telling the testers now to be available early and often, right? So that they can have their say, and as you go through all these different iterations. That's a very different mode of resourcing than it was to have all the test personnel available for some big events at the end of the cycle. And so these are, again, some knock-on effects that we're just working our way through, I'd say, in the department at the moment. And then finally, the last one, needing to have knowledgeable folks in the department that are really cognizant of software, comfortable with being the product owner and engaging with the vendor at this level, providing that kind of continuous feedback. We have a lot of really good folks, and I think we need to continue to grow that part of the workforce. And that's, again, a very long-range challenge for us to deal with. Okay. And I apologize, I'm running a little long here, so I think I might just hit these last slides very quickly, and then I want to save time for questions, right? Some of the things I just want to leave you with, one thing we need to watch out for is the idea of technical debt. In fact, we're working on a congressionally mandated study on this at the moment. Technical debt is a software jargon term for things that we implement very quickly in order to get them out, but we know we would like to come back and do a better job on. It's a very informal way of saying it. And this is something that's kind of baked into this whole idea of Agile, right? That my goal is to get things out in front of the user as quickly as possible so I can start getting that feedback. And so if I take a shortcut, if I implement something in a very limited way and I would like to come back and make it more robust later, that's actually very beneficial to me if it means I can get helpful feedback earlier and be able to take that into the technical work I'm doing. On the other hand, if I allow tons of these things to build up over time, what we see, and it's happened several times in the department, we see programs trying to deal so much with just getting through these, dealing with all the shortcuts that other people took, that that eats up all of our time, and I don't have as much opportunity to push out new capability. And so left unaddressed, there's a trade-off here where I want to make sure that I'm doing enough technical debt to get things out, but not so much that I'm drowning in it later on. And so paying attention to that is, again, something new that I think we have to do a little bit better job in the department. Another one we like to call this water scrum fall, right? Where I have my old engineering V and I do some Agile stuff down at the very bottom of it, right? So I've made all these big decisions. I've done my requirements decomposition, and now I'm going to do some iterations and get capability out and then do all my testing again later. This is sometimes a tempting place to go because it minimizes the amount of friction I have with other things in the department, but it doesn't give me any of the benefits of doing the Agile approach, right? It doesn't allow me to learn, it doesn't allow me to modify and adapt and make my requirements very dynamic. And so we need to be aware of, again, some of the window dressing there, but it's not really Agile underneath. I think one thing I'd really like to bat down is the idea that there's one right cadence that every program should conform to. And sometimes we get this, because some of the reviewers in particular will look at commercial industry and say, well, commercial, things like Google, Amazon, things on my phone, they're pushing out updates once a week. That's what the department should be doing. And yes, that works for those systems in the commercial world, but there is no one size fits all answer here. There's different, what I try to show on this is that there's different things at either end of this, the scale, right, that might pull me towards slower cadences or more frequent cadences, depending. Especially in the DoD, where I'm dealing with weapons system software, we still have the need to go through operational tests, authorities to operate, airworthiness certifications, for example. And these things all add time. On top of that, what we've done is sometimes gone and talked to the users, and they'll say, I don't want very frequent capability drops, right? Because the capability that you're giving me is so sensitive to the warfighting need, right? I mean, that I need time to develop new tactics. I need time to be trained on it. I can't be dealing with a lot of thrash and churn all the time. I need to have a very reliable relationship with the weapon itself. And so that, what I always say is we need to listen to the voice of the user. That's one of the basic principles of Agile, and adapt, where we're trying to get to all the time. So where we've kind of ended up is to recommend to programs that there's working software that's always ready to go, but I don't necessarily push out every version of that. I do that on some cadence that makes sense for the user community. And then just to quickly beat down, sometimes Agile means no documentation. Agile is not a get out of jail free card. Where documentation makes sense, it is still part of that. It's still part of the software acquisition policy. What we like to say instead is it needs to be a visible part of the planning, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding if I'm doing extra documentation, what that is buying for me, as opposed to just trying to get out new capabilities. But I make informed decisions rather than just trying to say, I don't need documentation ever. Yeah. Again, a myth that Agile means no data. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Because I'm getting out every iteration, I'm trying something new, I'm pushing out capabilities. I can collect a lot of data as I go. I can really get a good trend line about whether I'm satisfying the customer, about whether I'm able to live up to the commitments I made, about the capabilities and how quickly I could get them out. And so that if we do this right, there's actually more data rather than less. And then finally, the fact that Agile might mean no architecture. It's actually, again, we want to put a lot of effort up front into building an architecture a basis for the software system that's going to be easy to change and update as I go forward. That's not a trivial process, and that's something that we have to pay good engineering and technical attention to as we go. Okay. And again, last thing, that it doesn't work here, and I think we've now seen enough success stories in the department, as well as other federal programs, where we've seen a number of benefits. It does work here. It's a matter of adapting it and tailoring it in ways that are responsible and informed. And with that, I'm sorry I ran late. There's my email. I'm always willing to get conversations and do things offline, but if we have time for a few questions, Arun, I'd really love to hear what we had.
Yeah, we have, we'll take 5 or 10 minutes with a few of the questions. There's a bunch of questions trickling in here. And if you've got more questions, please add them to the Q&A box at the in your Zoom screen. So first question, please address the concept of scope creep, requirements creep, or good idea creep, I guess. Does it exist for Agile projects? How do you control this while still being Agile and addressing project objectives that you were contracted to do?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question, because I think that's one of the major points of friction that we see today for some of these systems. And especially where we get into, you know, there's a set of capabilities we're trying to get out on these programs, right, that the warfighter expects and demands in order to, you know, do what they need to do in their neck of the woods. What I would say is that it really does come back to, here we go, the roadmap at the end of the day, right? And I've seen some programs that really have taken too much to heart, I would say, the fact that this is meant to be dynamic, right? And we're always continuing to modify this, continuing to push things out. That's not the intent of the roadmap at all, right? It's to support a conscientious and constructive conversation between the development or the acquisition team and the warfighters, so that there's no, once we have an agreement about where some of those capabilities are going to pop out of this process and where we're expecting them to be, the acquisition development team doesn't unilaterally push those things out all the time, right? As we're working with the users, we're putting something in front of them, and if something becomes a higher priority, that's okay. You know, we have a process that's willing to accommodate that, but we also have to have the discussion about what that's pushing to the back, right? And so this discussion about maybe the next increment is going to be something different because the user really wants this urgently. If that's going to impact our larger commitments to getting those bigger deliveries of capability out, that's a conversation we have to have and agree to, you know, together. And so I would say there's not a magic answer there, other than this has to be something that's highly visible, that's transparent, and is negotiated between both parties, you know, the government and the vendor, or the government and the software team, at least I should say.
Great. So here's an acquisition question to follow on that. How do you reconcile Agile software principles with DoD contract requirements, for example, for milestone-based or earned value management?
Well, that's, see, I had a much better answer there until you put the earned value part on there, because I think that is, again, one of the things we're still struggling through. But let me answer the first part. In terms of contracting, I think we've seen a lot of really good examples now about different contracting strategies that will support the Agile processes better than others. There is a DoD Agile contracting guide that's out there, and I'm not a contracting expert myself, and so I would tend to point people to that for some of the good advice, but structuring the contract, for example, around IDIQs, you know, being able to push out different task orders, you know, rather than trying to, again, you know, get people to agree to a firm set of requirements up front, or some of the strategies that get involved there. I think the EVM question, like I said, is a little bit harder because I'm not sure that I've really, there is an Agile EVM kind of hybrid process out there. I'm not so sure that I personally have seen those marry up in a very instructive way just yet. You know, again, I'm speaking personally here, and hopefully not getting out in front of anybody in the department, but I think that there's still a lot of work and to really marry those up in a way that's constructive. There is some guidance today on the DAU, the AAF website, you know, all the guidance about the software pathways there, and I believe it touches on EVM, and that's probably a better resource than I can be today to answer that question, unfortunately.
Here's another one. We have a lot. We're not going to get through all these. In terms of user feedback and connection with users,
Mhm.
How much user time are you expecting? In a DoD context, those are operational forces that have lots to do. And
Yes.
second thing is, how do you address the geographical separation that you might run into between the vendor and the actual users?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think there's a lot of strategies for doing that. I think that some of it gets more complicated, of course, when you're dealing with classified systems. But usually being able to try and at least get a virtual session where you can bring the users together, even if they are geographically distributed, and kind of demo the program for them, or better yet, get them to run it, and provide you the feedback is possible in many cases still. I think some of the things that we've seen work successfully, again, are kind of traditional, not even specific to Agile, but trying to use weapons training or training exercises, as an opportunity to tack on some of here's the new capabilities and get feedback on it at that point, since the warfighter's already kind of taking time out of their operational scenario. It gets a little dangerous. It has to be done well, but again, trying to set up a user proxy, where we can get someone who's representative of the user, even if not kind of living in the day-to-day life of the user, to be able to be available more often and give the feedback is something that's worked well. When it's done well, you really need to choose a proxy who's able to speak, confidently for what the user really needs. And some of the programs, and I know not everyone necessarily would have the budget to do this, but taking folks from the program and embedding them with the users, so that they can be there on site, being able to gather as much intelligence on the ground as possible, hopefully to augment the user experience as well, has really worked well in some cases. So I think there's a lot of different strategies. It's kind of a matter of trying out different ones sometimes and making sure that we can find something that works in context.
We're gonna have to go more rapid fire here. So you talked about product owners on the government side and their role, but mostly, in fact, product owners are on the contractor side, right? And when you're a sub-tier versus prime or systems integrator relationship. So are you saying that there's then going to be product owners in both of those camps that then the software developers are dealing with at all times? Does it change the relationship between the government customer, the systems integrator, and the software developer?
Yes, I probably didn't mean to say that every product owner has to be government, but I think it's certainly at the levels where it makes sense. The government has to be part of that process. Whatever level it boils up to. What we really can't have to make this work, at least, is for the government to be kind of off on the other side of the fence, right? Where they throw things over and then maybe a lead integrator is doing all that work for them and the government just accepts it at the end of the day. What we've seen is that at least at that high level, the government owner really has to be there, be part of the process, to at least be willing to be part of the conversation, right? So that we're making clear what the requirements are, having confidence as we reprioritize things and what that might need to be, and really be part of that process in ways that hasn't always been true in the past.
All right, Forrest, we're going to have to call it at that point. I want to thank you for your presentation and thank all the audience members for your attendance and the great questions, which sadly we didn't get to all of them. We'll post the recording online as soon as possible. I want to mention that while we're talking about Agile software development, that ETI and Carnegie Mellon, including Forrest, have been working in partnership with Secretary Heidi Shu's team at OSD Research and Engineering on a soon-to-be released report looking at software as a DoD modernization priority, based on a workshop we held late last year, based on the fact that DoD has named software one of its critical technology areas. That report should be released in the upcoming months. Look forward to an announcement on that and a podcast as well. If you have feedback about the Tech 101 series, especially the topics you'd like to see us cover in the future, please email us at eti@ndia.org. Our next Tech 101 session will be on printed circuit boards 101 on June 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Look for registration information next month. I also want to take the opportunity to highlight some other upcoming NDIA events. Tomorrow, May 11th, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. is our hypersonic supply chain report launch. That's a hybrid event, so you can tune in online. Registration information is on the website. The 23rd Annual Science and Engineering Technology Conference is going to be held May 23rd to 25th in San Antonio, Texas. The ETI teams were working with the Science and Engineering Technology Division on that conference. ETI is also proud to announce that we're hosting our first annual Emerging Technologies Conference at the JW Marriott in Washington, D.C. That's August 28th to 30th, 2023. Registration information for all of these events are on our website, or feel free to reach out to us for more information. I also want to say a lot of the past videos, webinars, these Tech 101s, the podcasts are all available on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's at Emerging Tech ETI. And with that, I want to say thank you again to Forrest, and thank you all for attending.